Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about kinship. However, before we get to the lecture, I kind of want to touch briefly on the film, The Linguist. Hopefully you all got a chance to watch it. I know it got posted a little bit late. There were some technical errors in getting it up, so I apologize for that. What I'd like to kind of discuss briefly about the film is that I think the film does a fantastic job of sort of describing what ethnographic research actually looks like. While some of us don't necessarily dive so far into language as these two guys did, their process is very much like what we as anthropologists, as cultural anthropologists, might experience in the field. You could see throughout the film that they faced multiple challenges, issues of finding people to talk to. What is it like to be in Siberia and trying to find speakers of a language that's disappearing, having a speaker right there that isn't necessarily upfront and forthcoming about it. And this is due to the fact of trust, right? Eventually, their representative became a fantastic source of information, but it took a while for him to warm up to these two researchers and to look at them and say, you know what, I trust these guys. They're not going to get me into any trouble, which that can be a problem, especially when you're living in a community, a minority community, that is being persecuted by a larger community, in this case, the Russian government. This is the same thing that's happening here in the United States, especially when it comes to Native American populations. So we can see some of the issues that these two researchers were facing there, some of the issues that they had with people that they thought were possibly speakers of this language when I believe it was in Bolivia. Came across a guy who said he was a native speaker and wasn't. Right? Why would you say that you are when you are not? Well, there are multiple reasons why. In this case, I suspect that he was probably angling for some sort of benefit by helping the researchers. So, you know, there's issues there. You can see sort of the experiences that these guys had. Fantastic, amazing experiences meeting fantastic people, being put into uncomfortable situations and yet going with it and then enjoying it and being able to travel around the world and experience all this kind of stuff. This is what a lot of anthropologists end up doing. This is where a lot of folks will, you know, get an opportunity to go study in another country or get to work in different cultures and experience those kinds of activities. I know my short time in Kenya was absolutely amazing. My work on Native American reservations has been nothing but eye-opening and just incredible. Even in the hardships that we might experience, we are learning something from those experiences. And I think that this film did a great job of kind of showcasing what the field experience is like. I think on a more serious note, I hope that as you were watching this film, you got the opportunity to look and see what some of the issues that a lot of people are facing around the world, specifically being the loss of language. When we look at these different cultures and what's happening through globalization, and we see these folks that are being bombarded with outside culture, when we see small native groups that are still living very much traditional ways and having encroaching outside influences coming in and having an impact, we can start to understand why some of these languages are disappearing. That's not to say that languages haven't been disappearing and being created on a regular basis. The problem is that the creation of right now, I'm pretty sure, is less than what's being destroyed. And that has to do with the fact that globalization is spreading at a much quicker pace than I think people are able to create new ideas and new cultures. So we're seeing more things being forced together into larger groups where smaller communities that might have had a distinct language are facing some very serious problems. So that's something that we really have to consider. And I think this film kind of dives into that a little bit, and to understand sort of the importance of not only trying to understand these languages, but to understand why it's important to have these languages and the uniqueness of these languages and what they have to offer, specifically like, medicine and knowledge of the environment. So I think it's a great movie. If you haven't watched it, definitely watch it. If you have trouble watching it, it's through the library, so it's through Auraria Library, and you should be able to sign on through your regular portal. Okay, and if you have trouble doing that, give the library a call. They can help you access the portal itself. I'm not an IT person when it comes to that kind of stuff. The best thing that I can suggest that you do is to call up the library and say, there's a video online, here's the link, how do I access it? And they should be able to get you in. So, that being said, I think we'll go ahead and jump into this week's lecture. We're going to be talking about kinship. And what is kinship? Well, kinship basically is a means for us to figure out how families are made up. And I'm going to use families in a loose sense. Oftentimes, when we think about kinship, it's related to like our biological relationships. So it goes beyond that, however. Kinship is not just about our biological relationships, but also our very close-knit friendships and other relationships that we have a lot of bonding to. It helps us to determine various things about a community. If we go into a community somewhere and we want to know how that community is structured, one of the things that we're going to take a look at is how their families are structured. And not all families are constructed the same way. And we're going to be getting into how anthropologists have divided family structure up a little bit later on. But suffice to say that when we're looking at doing a kinship analysis, the things that we're looking for is how is it structured, who has authority, what are the rights and responsibilities of each of these family members. That way, as we look at families and how they're organized, we can start to think about how the community might be structured in similar ways. And it might give us an insight into the broader spectrum of a community and what they might be doing even outside of their immediate kinship. What's their relationship to religion and political structure and all of that. We also need to understand that kinships are oftentimes more they have a stronger bond than just about any other type of relationship. And these relationships or networks include stuff like, your religious institution. So whatever religion you belong to, or political affiliation, or social or economic communities that you belong to. Kinship has a tendency to be one of these structures that are very, very difficult to break when it comes to how they are seen within the community, and how much of an impact they can have, and how much control that kinship group will have over the actions of the individuals within that group. So it's important to understand how kinship is organized, and how much of an impact it can have on your research. So we look for information about how these structures are organized, how they have connections, and what those connections mean. And we can understand that these relationships can help us understand not only their social networks and the cultural imperatives of that community, whether or not they might be individualistic, whether they might be community-based. We can get certain ideas about how a culture is going to act depending on how that family structure is created. So it's easy to kind of look at this and make some assumptions about how people will behave and what they might do. We learn a lot about cultural norms and values through doing kinship analysis. And these come from asking questions about, what they find important about their community. What are the things that they respect? What are the things that they are concerned about? And if we ask each member of that family, we should get relatively similar responses. And by getting those similar responses, we can start to put together these different ideas, different concepts of what's important to that community. So it's important to be able to understand how these are put together. Again, one of the things that we oftentimes do is go into the graveyard, right? I've talked about this in prior lectures, why it's important to understand how people relate to the dead and how they treat their relatives that have passed on. We can gain a lot of insight into not only the importance of what people might consider to be the afterlife or religious activities, and how they see their dearly departed, whether or not there is an afterlife. And if there is an afterlife, you might find things like grave goods. Oftentimes these grave goods are placed within a grave and expected to be used by the deceased in the afterlife. So, a great case of this are like the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians oftentimes include these really amazing grave goods in their, especially when we look at like the pharaohs, because they're expected to have this afterlife, and so they're going to need a bunch of stuff with them. So they will include these items. And to a certain degree, we do the same thing with our own graves. Like, we will include personal items that individual might have really liked. So maybe a copy of their favorite book, or some jewelry that they were very fond of. And it goes with them as sort of like a way of keeping them happy in the afterlife if they have that with them. So there are different approaches that cultures might have. If you think about like maybe the Vikings, right? The Vikings would include weapons and shields and in some cases sacrifices to include as they went on to the afterlife. So knowing what's going on there, knowing how people send off their loved ones is a great way to understand how they look at each other, right? And what those expectations are while you're alive. In the United States, we have, when we talk about descent groups, there's a couple of ways that we look at this. Oftentimes, descent groups are directly related to the matriarchy and to the patriarchy, and include marriages. And so, if you get married to someone, and you have kids, then their direct descent groups are on both sides of the family. So we do have this type of lineage where we will trace back to different individuals within our past, and so we will link directly to them. And we try and go back as far as we possibly can, creating this family tree. Now, what else we have, and it's not oftentimes popular in sort of Western civilization. It's certainly been the case in a lot of Native American groups where we have clans. Clans are basically descent groups that might have an ancestor that is known, but you might not have any direct relationship to that person. You might not be able to trace your lineage directly, but you have a direct ancestor. And the other thing about that direct ancestor is that sometimes that ancestor could be mythical, okay? And by mythical, I don't mean like necessarily magical. I think that's a distinction that we have to make. Mythical can be this idea of something greater than just an individual. It can also be related to like a totem. So there might be a relationship to, say, bears or rabbit or snake clan or crow clan or something along that line, where it might be you might be related to a specific animal ancestry. And in that case, your relationship within that clan can be just as deep and just as important as the other type of descent. And it can have a little bit more, possibly more spiritual meaning, and have something something a little bit different that binds people together, sometimes much more idealistic. And so clan descent groups are really interesting to try and understand, because it's not always through direct lineage, but through ideology in some cases. So, but just as important as if you're able to trace back to other groups. So in the U.S., we primarily follow a bilateral descent. So that's matriarchy and patriarchy. So mothers and fathers. The majority of the world, however, follows a patrilineal approach, basically following their father's side of the lineage. And by recognizing that, we are capable of understanding how things are sort of organized and where the power falls into. So, when we talk about the patriarchy, this is a real issue. This is something that we are definitely dealing with on an everyday basis. So I think it's important to recognize how people dissent, or how they recognize dissent within their communities. That way you can get a better understanding of how people in general relate to each other. Prior to the introduction of the horse within the United States, it's believed that most Native Americans were matrilineal in descent. So they followed the mother's descent line. And this is kind of really important to understand how people relate to each other in different times of, say, like economic success. Prior to sort of Western contact, it's believed that a lot of Native American groups were matrilineal in descent, and it had more to do that a lot of these communities were hunter-gatherers. Certainly not all. We have some evidence that there were some very, very large communities, upwards of possibly 1 million people in some cases. And a lot of these folks didn't have the same sort of issues that we might see now. They would be, a lot of folks would probably be more nomadic. Especially in sort of the western United States until you get to the coastlines, where in the coast, a lot of times you have a lot of resources. And this is where a lot of this comes into play, is that resources can have a direct impact on family structure. If you have a large amount of resources, you can spend less time gathering those resources. So if we look at like the Pacific Northwest, Northern California through Washington up into Canada, we see some of the most resource heavy places in the entire country, where most communities could collect resources for about half the year and then have enough food for the other half of the year. A lot of this has to do with fishing. This is oftentimes the case with a lot of coastal communities. So they had a lot more resources to go around. When you have more resources, you can become more stationary. So you don't have to travel around as much, and you don't have to worry about collecting those resources, and then you can focus on doing other activities. The unfortunate aspect is that a lot of times when you have the time to sit around and contemplate, you can create a lot of really cool things. You create religion, you create ideology and education, but as communities grow, contact with your neighbors becomes more frequent, and sometimes they can become more violent. And so sometimes when you're duking it out for resources, communities will go from a matriarchy to a patriarchy. And that's where you have warriors come into play, where they will take in a position. So as we look at other communities that are hunter-gatherers, oftentimes these are smaller communities and not so much warfaring, but just nomadic. And there aren't a lot of people to fight. You're not going to find a lot of people out there, smaller groups. And when you find other groups, oftentimes you're friendly, because if you need resources and they have it, then they'll help you. If you have resources and they need it, you'll help them. And it's also how you would exchange genetic material, right? Marrying outside of the clan, as it were, outside of your group. So these can be really important aspects, and we'll talk more about this in a few. So a lot of what we believe happened in North America was sort of this matrilineal descent. However, a lot of that changed with the introduction of the horse and the rifle. So when the Spanish brought over horses and literally let them loose, sent them free, and the idea was that they would release a whole bunch of horses, and then eventually those horses would multiply, and then you could recapture those horses down the line. This was also the case with other domestic animals such as pigs and cattle in some respects, so that they could go out there, multiply, and then be harvested later. So with the introduction of the horse, movement became much easier. And because it became easier, some groups decided that, we don't necessarily need to work so hard to collect this food when our neighbor over here has it. We could just go over and take it. So we started seeing more and more warfare between different groups as the horse became more available, and then ultimately the rifle, which became made a huge impact within Native American groups. So that becomes a big issue later on, and we're not going to get into that so much, but just how families can change due to the impact of new technologies. And that's kind of what this whole point was, is to understand that different communities, different family groups, different ways of organizing people can be impacted through different types of events. So in this case, it was the introduction of the horse and the rifle. So we can understand how things might have been at one point versus how things ended up being, and how communities can change ideologically when different things are incorporated.